The first step is to create what we call an underpainting. This is done with earth colors, a lot of turpentine, and some oil. The idea is to keep the painting really thin and to be able to draw with the brush. This is an example from another painting. Once our drawing is more or less accurate and at the stage that we want, then we can proceed by applying the first layers of thin paint. Notice that this is going to be dripping at some point. It is because I'm using quite a lot of turpentine and I'm using a bit of linseed oil. This is meant to be keeping the painting really thin. When we are working with oil paints, remember the rule that we want to work with thin paint at the beginning and on the later stages, fat paint. Fat and thin make reference to the amount of oil present in the mixture. So ideally, we want to start with some solvents. Could be turpentine, could be mineral spirits, odorless solvents. And as the painting progresses, we're going to start applying either more paint or more paint with some oil medium. Could be linseed oil, stand oil, or other type of oil. Our aim at this stage is to cover all the canvas with a thin coating of paint. Ideally, we don't want to have any white spots. This is called killing the white. By removing the white from the canvas, we can assess properly the color relationships without having the disturbance of white, pure white spots messing with our perception of color. Once this is achieved, we can start focusing on particular areas. Now I'm using a dark mixture to start laying the foundations of what's going to be the forest that we see in the distance, in the middle ground. Because this is going to be one of the darkest parts of the piece, I am focusing on this area first. I like to start with the darkest darks when it comes to applying the first brush strokes. Once we cover this area, we can move into the background. This is going to be the furthest layer of our painting, not including the sky, of course. So we're going to be using a lot of white and a lot of blues into the mixes. We want to keep these colors desaturated and on a higher note in terms of value. This is going to achieve what we call atmospheric perspective. In theory, the further away an object is going to be less contrast and the color that we are applying is going to be more related to the color of the atmosphere. In this case, the sky and the atmosphere is leaning towards the blue. If we were talking about a sunset scene, then maybe the colors would be leaning more towards the orange. Essentially, this is basically influenced by the light. So if the light is leaning towards the blues, then the object on the distance is going to be having a lot of blues into the mix. And if the light is leaning towards yellow or orange, then those tones are going to be present. Atmospheric perspective is basically the result of suspended dust particles being lit by the dominant light source. For creating the texture of the forest in the mountain, I am using tiny strokes in a perpendicular fashion. Ideally, this is going to create a pattern that is going to be varying from blues to greens and is going to give the illusion of trees in the distance. you can play around with these mixtures. You can use lighter tones, darker tones, but always have in mind that you don't want to go either too high or too low with the value, that is the light present in the particular area, and you want to keep the colors desaturated and leaning towards the blues. It is always helpful when dealing with paintings like this to think in terms of color groups. So on the foreground we have one color group, middle ground is another, and then we have the background and the sky. So each one of these groups are going to share some similarities, and we can start approaching them in a broader way and then going better in terms of detail, but only when we have the foundations established, then we can later proceed with some details. I'm using an opportunity to improve the edge of the mountain in the background. Ideally we want to keep our edges sharp unless we are going for a softer shape. For example, with the trees in the middle ground, then we can go a bit softer with some edges. The characteristics of a tree make them apparent in an uneven shape, so all the branches and all the leaves are breaking the figure, and they are making the tree seem like a softer shape in comparison, for example, with the edge of the mountain. Notice too that the color that we were using for the underpainting is peeking through the later brush strokes. Ideally, this creates an effect of making the inner part of the tree look warmer in comparison to the outside. Those tonal relationships can change. In this particular instance, we don't have such a harsh sunlight, so we can make the inner parts of the tree a bit warmer in comparison to the outside. But again, those relationships change depending on what is the dominant light source. Once the middle ground is a bit more detailed, then we can move to the foreground. Now I'm starting with little brush strokes to represent some of the grass that I see. In this particular area we have two types of grass. One is short and taken care of, and closer to the viewer we have some sort of wild grass. Ideally we want to keep this relationship present, and we want to make that distinction. So for the green grass, the part which is neater, let's say, I'm using soft green mixed with some yellows to create the impression of light. And on the foreground I am going for a bit of a paler grass. There are some flowers peeking through, and later we're going to be using some more paint to create a 3D effect. Basically, the closer to the viewer some objects are, they're going to be represented with more quantity of paint. These 3D effects help us understand better the scene, and it creates more depth in the painting. There are many ways in which we can use the brush, and depending on the amount of paint that we have, we can create all sorts of effects. Now what I'm doing is I'm kind of scooping paint out of the palette with the side of the brush, and then I'm moving it vertically. Ideally, what I'm going after is some sort of thick application of paint that we as artists call impasto. This is helping with the 3D effect that I was mentioning with the grass. Let's take a better look from the side to see the texture effect that I was mentioning. Essentially, painting sometimes comes really close to sculpture, because with this 3D application of paint, it's almost like we are creating the body of each particular strand of grass. This is just another of the many tools that painters have at their disposal to create this kind of convincing effect. It is important to use effects like this selectively. We don't want to overuse it. It is usual to be moving around once we start building up on the details. Now I'm reworking some of the middle ground because trees are particularly tricky when it comes to creating a realistic look. So essentially, we build it from the back to the front. First, we were establishing a base color, then we can draw some of the branches and the trunks, and after we have that established, we can start adding up the foliage. And ideally, we want to keep the tonal relationships and we want to vary the color in a very subtle way. We don't want to use pure green all over. We're mixing greens with blues and we are mixing greens with warmer tones. This is going to create the effect like some leaves are being lit by the blue of the sky and some other leaves are being hit by the sunlight. It creates a more convincing effect. When it comes to the tools that I'm using, once all the surface has been covered with some type of underpainting, then I'm switching to a tiny brush. I usually like these types of materials to work with because they allow for a sharper effect when it comes to the details. We have a lot of precision. Think of a pencil that is really well sharpened. That is the effect that we have with a tiny brush like this. So once we've established the base color of a particular area, then I switch to a sharper tool. The way in which I create the leaves is similar to the way I apply the paint for the forest in the mountain. Just tiny dabs of paint and I'm poking the canvas really softly to modulate the different areas. It is important to be versatile when it comes to brushwork. We can scrape, we can smear, we can poke, we can do all sort of things with the same tool. So being versatile and thinking outside the box is usually very helpful. Also, we can be using some kind of palette knife to be applying the paint. This is particularly helpful for scraping and for applying some bigger quantities of paint. For example, the grass in the foreground, we could have been using a palette knife to create the grass strands, and the effect would have been really good. I haven't talked a lot about the sky. Usually what I do when it comes to the sky is apply a really thin layer of blue that is, of course, mixed with turpentine and some linseed oil. Once we have that base tone, I start applying some thicker paint. And usually we need to keep in mind that the lower we are painting to the horizon, there are going to be more suspended particles. So in this case, you can notice that just above the mountain, the sky is not as blue as on the top part of the canvas. The higher we get, the deeper the blues and the more pure the air. That is a relationship that we want to keep in terms of creating convincing atmospheric perspective. Okay, so the final product. This piece was later continued at the studio, but I managed to achieve a really successful and satisfactory result on location, just in time before a storm hit. This was the same scene that we were painting a couple of minutes after I finished. This is something we need to consider when we are painting outdoors. We're always at the mercy of Mother Nature.